You have these sort of leaps and bounds. Whenever you have a technological leap, you have terrorists utilizing that, and that has been constant throughout history. For the intelligence services, it's a real nightmare. They go from the low scale, no footprint, all the way up to AI, asking AI, what can we attack and how should we attack it?
A warm welcome to Geopolcast, the podcast from WTW exploring geopolitics and its impact. My name is Elisabeth Braw. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where I focus on the intersection between geopolitics and the globalized economy. I'm also the author of Goodbye Globalization. In each episode of Geopolcast, I'm joined by experts who can help us better understand geopolitically related issues of the day. In recent episodes, we have discussed attacks on global shipping, risks facing the oil and gas sector, and threats to sea-based infrastructure, among much else. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by Magnus, one of the world's leading experts on terrorism. Magnus built a much-respected Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St Andrews in the UK, where he worked for many years. And today, he is a strategic advisor at the Centre for Societal Security at the Swedish Defence University, and he is also a special advisor to the EU Radicalisation Awareness Network. Now, some people in the West may have forgotten about terrorism in the past couple of years, and then news arrived that Taylor Swift's concerts in Vienna would be cancelled because the authorities had uncovered a terrorist plan against them. Because the authorities had uncovered a terrorist plot against them. Yes, even though Western counterterrorism efforts have managed to keep us safe in recent years, terrorism is never far away. We've had the Westminster Bridge and the Manchester Arena attacks in the UK, the Brussels attack last year that killed 2 Swedish citizens, and several attacks in Germany and France, including one where the perpetrator slit the throat of an elderly priest, and many more attacks. But fortunately, we haven't had a 9/11 style attack. But the terrorists who planned to target a Taylor Swift concert clearly wanted lots of victims. Recently, WTW published its new Terrorism Pools Index, and one of the things that stands out there is the mention of how terrorists are likely to exploit AI. This will clearly add more fuel to terrorist groups' incendiary activities. Magnus, first of all, welcome to Geopolcast, and second of all, how surprised were you to hear of the plot against Taylor Swift?
Well, thank you so much. And I was surprised, of course, because it's not that concerts by popular, artists and so on have not been targeted before, but you're always surprised when these plots occur, and particularly the scale and scope of this. Of course, the CIA director recently came out and said, look, these youngsters were planning to kill tens of thousands of individuals by using explosives and knives outside the concert hall when they were playing in Austria. Whether they would have been able to do that is a difficult question, but they canceled the whole tour. So, of course, it has massive ripple effect. And of course, we all remember Ariana Grande's the attack against the concert outside the concert hall or the arena in 2017 by a terrorist who blew themselves up outside. So, of course, huge venues, huge popular venues, etc., are a very attractive target. And I was not so surprised that, of course, the Islamic State or ISIS was the inspiration for these youngsters. We've had a number of different plots across Europe that indicate that there is a sort of a resurgence of terrorism plots that we have been spared from, relatively speaking, over the last few years.
What we've seen in the past couple of decades since 9/11 is, as you say, terrorism morphing. And you have met, you met long before 9/11, some of the most notable radical leaders and practitioners of the day, including in Hezbollah, including in Hamas. What would you say terrorist groups are doing differently today compared to 25 years ago? Or are we talking about just the traditional terrorist or militant extremist groups being joined by new practitioners?
Well, I think, the big difference is, of course, the watershed moment was 9/11. When you had this sort of, international brigade of terrorists who were coming from across the globe planning and plotting mass casualty attacks. It wasn't that we hadn't had that before, but the scale and scope of course, the 9/11 changed everything. Groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, they are socially embedded within their communities, just like the Provisional IRA and others in Northern Ireland, in that they have social, political, military wings that they use, and their violence is very targeted. When you have these sort of groups that you have with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, you have a much sort of unconstrained level of violence. They are, you also, riding, I know you've written a book on globalization, they're riding on the wave of globalization, the dark underside of globalization, and they are connecting across boundaries, they are organizing, they are using the latest technology, they are recruiting individuals from afar, using gaming, using all sort of social media platforms that you can imagine. So I think that the big issue is that the level of constraints that sometimes exists on past groups is no longer there, and that it is really a multinational enterprise that really require massive intelligence cooperation by the West to really foil these type of attacks that are in the pipeline. I can say in relation to the Austria attack, it was the US authorities, US intelligence community that actually sort of tipped off the Austrian counterparts who were able then to foil this attack.
And since you mentioned the technological tools they use, as I said, one of the things that leapt out at me in the new WTW report on terrorism was the mention of terrorist groups exploiting AI. And it feels like, frankly, a totally hopeless situation. AI, once it's out there, nobody can stop anybody from using it. So what does that mean for Western societies, indeed for any societies? Does it mean that maybe we as Western societies should ask AI companies and the wider tech community to do more to help? Because it's certainly beyond the capabilities and resources of the police.
Well, really good question. I mean, you have these sort of leaps and bounds. Whenever you have a technological leap, you have terrorists utilizing that, and that has been constant throughout history. And before I go into AI, let me just sort of say that, the way in which the 9/11 hijackers sort of communicated was going very low tech. They actually used draft messages in Hotmail, Yahoo accounts, etc., and they wrote drafts, and then they, the messages wouldn't be sent. So, intelligence community and signals intelligence would have to sort of break in to internet cafes in faraway lands, Pakistan, other places, to be able to sort of detect what are they doing, and they're also using code. So they use code words, code names, and all terrorist groups have been using that. In other words, they have predetermined code words and places which they use when they try to communicate, to try to sort of be smarter than the signals and intelligence community. And what we really are, seeing is you have two battles going on at the same time. You have the cells, the physical fight, the war on terror happening, you're arresting people. And then you have the virtual dimension where they're chasing individuals through their social media, intercepting communication, etc. Now, AI comes into this whole world, and what can AI do for terrorist organizations, etc.? Well, first of all, it can identify vulnerable critical infrastructure protection, which is, of course, a problem, depending on, how smart they are putting in questions. Secondly, you also have, you can use other sort of type of technologies. Terrorists are now using drones. They're using 3D printing. They're using all the sort of ways in which makes it more difficult to be able to be detected. So you can sort of see that for the intelligence services, it's a real nightmare. They go from the low scale, no footprint, all the way up to sort of AI, asking AI, what can we attack and how should we attack it? And that is, of course, something that we have to sort of ask the AI providers, et cetera, to see if they can also foil that. But let me also say one thing that, we should not underestimate the ability of our signals intelligence community, the government communication headquarters, GCHQ, NSA, other signals intelligence community, their ability to be able to sort of detect anomalies and detect different threats. So they have a pretty good handle. They have a pretty good way of following how terrorism evolves, but also its interface with technology. But of course, they can't guard everything. They cannot sort of make foolproof way in which you can protect society.
Indeed, and turning the table around a bit, AI will help them better spot anomalies because they can't be everywhere all the time. But with more use of more AI, that will help their ability to notice when things are out of the ordinary.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think AI can make life a lot easier also in relation to seeing, what are the real signals from the massive information that's out there, that's being sent, etc. And I think that will also help. And therefore, I mean, there's huge discussions within the intelligence community, etc., with different companies that can provide really high resolution mechanisms to use AI in a very intelligent way. So we're on the cusp of really a real sort of revolution in this. But you can also sort of see the sort of dilemma because, in the future we will have also self-driving cars, etc. And you can imagine that terrorists would maybe, use self-driving cars as a delivery mechanism, or they can use drones as a delivery mechanism in relation. And we've already seen that in Syria when ISIS was using drones, both in terms of reconnaissance, but also in terms of delivery. And you saw that in the Hamas attack. Hamas had sent up about 140 drones with cameras, but also with bombs that they sort of took out the entire Israeli Defense Forces' eyes and ears. They targeted the communication and the see and shoot portals, on the Iron Wall. So they sort of completely took out in one swoop the entire defense mechanism for the Iron Wall that surrounds Gaza.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, Magnus, is other forms of terrorism. So we are seeing in the Western world increasing left-wing terrorism, far left terrorism. We're seeing increasing far-right terrorism. And so it seems like we have this plethora of groups that are trying to harm our societies. And there raises a question, do they ever collaborate, or are they in fierce competition against one another? And I think both are frightening prospects, because if it's collaboration, then that's frightening, clearly. But if it's fierce competition, then they try to outdo one another.
Well, I think, what we're also seeing, and we been speaking a lot about the Salafi jihadi, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, other radical Islamist groups. But you also have sort of a movement of right-wing, far-right populism. Far-right populism, you have neo-Nazi groups that are collaborating. They are collaborating with Russia. They are collaborating, and they have been for a long time, with each other as well. So you have them creating podcasts, interacting with each other, using cryptocurrencies. And the real sort of scare is that, far-right populism and right-wing extremism is really increasing a lot. And that is also creating huge problems because they fuel, of course, polarization in society. So in some sense, even though, radical Islamists and right-wing do not really sort of collaborate physically or operationally, but their intended outcome is to create massive polarization in society. And they use violence to that effect. Of course, now also we have left-wing groups that are reacting to right-wing groups, but also they are using the Israeli, war in Gaza against Hamas, the issue of Gaza, as a rallying point, as a rallying cry. So you also have the merger of left-wing forces with Islamist forces that are sort of coalescing. This is what we sometimes see, in relation to what I call woke Islamists, using post-colonial identity politics to be able to target the West, target also Israel. What unites all of these sort of groups is, of course, anti-Semitism. In relation to the radical Islamists, they go against Israel. The far right, of course, also against Israel. And of course, the left wing now are also against Israel and Jews, and they use anti-Semitism as a sort of the uniting ground. Is that they are anti-Semitic and that they believe in conspiracy theories, and that they also, because of West support for Israel, target the West. And that is a huge issue, a huge problem. The geopolitics is the most important thing. And I know this is what the pod is about. So.
But it's also about the effects of geopolitics on business. And one thing that we're seeing is obviously somebody paying the price, the financial price, and obviously psychological and so forth, but also the financial or the economic price of terrorist attacks. And what is obvious and what's interesting in this WTW report that just came out is how hard governments try to work out schemes where they do ultimately guarantee any terrorism risk, simply because the potential costs to privately operated companies would be too severe, and yet they are being targeted, or they are always under threat. What I'm keen to understand from you, Magnus, this is the last question, is what companies can do to reduce the terrorism threat directed against them, considering that they are being targeted or hit simply because they happen to be Western companies. Is there anything companies can do short of saying, please don't attack me, and hope that the threat goes away? Clearly, judging from the situation in the Red Sea, where many shipping companies have sort of made the case to the Houthis that, please don't target us, we're harmless. It doesn't work. So what else can Western companies do?
Well, it's a huge question because you're operating sort of globally in different sectors and businesses. But I think, that's why we have security companies that can provide lots of different training. If executives go to, hostile places, how do you protect yourself? If you do business in China, you never bring any electronics with you, because if you have any sort of secrets, and then I am sure that they will get to those secrets if you enter the country, etc. So, these kind of advice have been around a long time. Protecting against insider threats is quite important. Who are you employing? What are background checks on them? So, also, who do you do business with? Know your customer. You do not want to do businesses with shady players, but there is a sort of a whole architecture for companies. I mean, you also have kidnap and ransom. There are lots of corporate individuals or others who get placed in a situation where either they're blackmailed or maybe they are kidnapped or face bodily harm. And I know a lot of different companies that can provide life-saving advice, but also can be absolutely critical to be able to handle the whole spectrum of these different aspects. They do background searches on employees, prospective employees. They can help you if you're out in different parts of the world, in different regions. For example, Africa right now is incredibly the epicenter of jihadism, because ISIS and the forces are spreading, not only in the Sahel area in the East Africa, but also in Central Africa and Southern Africa. So you have to really sort of know the place where you're traveling to, if you're traveling, and you have to be able to handle it. And let me tell you, I mean, I've been doing this work for over 35 years around the world. It was a lot easier before because there were rules to the game. It was safer to move around. Today, going to Africa, to parts of the Middle East, to different countries. You don't want to do that without having really good backup.
And on top of that, it's obviously terrorism, but in combination with Russia then helping or being asked, being invited to help those governments in Africa and probably soon elsewhere, experiencing that terrorism in their country. So it's a couple of layers of instability facing Western companies.
Yeah, I just wanted to add just two things, and that is that you have also these hostile states who are trying to buy up properties or establish themselves in, close to military installations of critical infrastructure, etc. So you have to sort of be very wary of that and orientate around this issue. And also you have to be very wary about how they try to also infiltrate not just businesses, but also different government agencies, etc., to be able to either gain access to information or gain access to money for whatever reason.
Indeed, and that's something we'll come back to on a future episode of GeoPodcast, and that is to say thank you, Magnus, very much, and you're welcome to come back and discuss further developments, because there will be developments in terrorism. And it's also, I was going to hope to end on a somewhat hopeful note. I didn't manage to do that, but the hopeful note is that we'll come back to this issue and discuss more. To get future episodes as soon as they are released, make sure to subscribe to GeoPodcast. You can find us via your usual podcast players, and please recommend us to your friends and colleagues. Until next time.
Thank you for joining us for this WTW podcast featuring the latest perspectives on the intersection of people, capital, and risk. For more information, visit the Insights section of WTWCO.com. Willis Towers Watson offers insurance-related services through its appropriately licensed and authorized companies in each country in which Willis Towers Watson operates. For further authorization and regulatory details about our Willis Towers Watson legal entities operating in your country, please refer to our Willis Towers Watson website. It is a regulatory requirement for us to consider our local licensing requirements. The information given in this podcast is believed to be accurate at the date of publication. This information may have subsequently changed or have been superseded and should not be relied upon to be accurate or suitable after this date. This podcast offers a general overview of its subject matter. It does not necessarily address every aspect of its subject or every product available in the market, and we disclaimer all liability to the fullest extent permitted by law. It is not intended to be and should not be used to replace specific advice relating to individual situations, and we do not offer, and this should not be seen as, legal, accounting, or tax advice. If you intend to take any action or make any decision on the basis of the content of this podcast, you should first seek specific advice from an appropriate professional. Some of the information in this podcast may be compiled from third-party sources we consider to be reliable. However, we do not guarantee and are not responsible for the accuracy of such. The views expressed are not necessarily those of Willis Towers Watson. Copyright Willis Towers Watson 2023. All rights reserved.